Welcome everyone to our final workshop for Black LA, Shifting the Narrative. We've been spending the last two sessions looking at some really amazing, the last session and this session looking at some amazing local examples of Black history. Last time we were joined by Crystal Jackson and she was telling us about the rich history in Pacoima. And today we're going to be joined by historian Allison Jefferson, who's going to tell us the story of the Belmar community in Santa Monica. We're really excited to hear and learn about that and also explore some curriculum related to that talk. As always, we start off with a land acknowledgement. And at UCLA, we are on Tongva land, and we acknowledge that the Tongva Gabrielino people are the traditional caretakers of this land known as Tovangar, which is LA basin to the Southern Channel Islands. And just kind of a little bit about who we are. The History Geography Project works closely with teachers. We collaborate with teachers. Our goals are always to make history relevant and empowering for students. I think that this talk really personifies the approach that we have to history education, and where some of our collaborators are here, including Shomara and Christina, and even historian Allison Jefferson collaborated with us and teachers to design some of the curricular pieces we're going to be showing you later. All right, and we're also part of this statewide network called the California History Social Science Project. And at the end of this workshop today, we'll have a couple of learning opportunities for you. We'll share links that are connected to our site in the larger CHSSP network. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to my colleague Amparo.
So we are wondering if you could indulge us in the chat, or if you want to unmute. We're a small group. What do you see in this picture, and what are you wondering about? Take a look at this postcard.
I see half of the beach has umbrellas, very colorful umbrellas, and I'm wondering why they're shaded and the other half isn't.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Well, as a participant, I'll say there's a big gap there. There's a round or octagon building, and I think that's the lifeguard station, and there's a big gap there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I see two U.S. flags close to that little yellow building that Dr. Jefferson was talking about. And in the background, I see a roller coaster on a pier.
One wondering that I had was, I noticed that this is Santa Monica, so I'm wondering if the building in the left-hand bottom corner is already the carousel. So that makes me wonder what the year for this picture.
So actually this picture is that building that you're pointing at, that is the Casa Del Mar Hotel. And that is between Pico and Bay Street.
Thank you.
And it's the hotel now, but then it was a private club. And I don't think it says that in the notes on the card. It just tells you looking towards Ocean Park from beach clubs.
I wonder, where are all these people coming from? This seems like a lot of people to be at the beach in the past. I'm assuming Santa Monica was less populous. So where are all these people coming from?
Mm.
And then also in terms of thinking about today versus when this picture was done. So since I know a little bit, I'll just say that the shoreline looks different now than what it looks like in this picture.
So this is looking south towards Ocean Park from the beach clubs. And we don't have a date, but we know that it was one of those novelty postcards, right? It doesn't answer the questions about when, it doesn't answer the questions about what is there now necessarily, but also where all these people were coming from. Somebody asked, like, where did all these people come from? And I started to think, was this when we had the red lines and the incredible transportation, or is this closer to today, right? And I don't know about you guys, but from East LA to go to Santa Monica, it used to take us 2.5 hours on the bus. So, all right. So even if that's the case, then wow, people really were invested in coming, right? Even more so. So that would be interesting for sure. And we have another picture for you to think about. I know some of you who have done this work have seen this. All right, here's another one. What do we notice and what are we thinking about this picture?
I just want to say that I really love this photo because it just reveals so much. There's like a lot of layers to it, and the one layer that I think Amparo is asking us to focus on it is one of the ones in my experience that I was like saw at the very end of this photo. I was like, oh yeah, it kind of caught my attention. So we're wondering if it catches your attention as well. There's something about this photo.
Well, I'll say the picture is facing south. They're taking the picture south. So as we look at the picture, since I know so much about it, the water, the ocean line is on the right.
Wait,
and they're really young. They're like, they're like 20-ish.
They're very young. And also, I was also wondering, is this a weekend or is this a weekday, right? In terms of, you get the feeling there's lots of other umbrellas. You see some shadows or other people. So I'm wondering, is this like on the weekend at the beach, right? So for those of you who have not seen this picture before, right? This is, well, two things. One of the things that we wanted to point out is that behind the couple, you see a fence, right? For those of you who haven't seen this picture before, there's a fence there. And there's some words about a club. This is Verna Descartes and Arthur Lewis, and they are at a segregated section of Santa Monica Beach. So it starts to get us to think about, why was there a gap in the previous picture, right? Is this picture taken near where there was a gap? Could we see a fence in the previous picture, right? And they're also in front of a sign that says Club Casa. We think it says Club Casa Belmar. We're not sure.
It says Club Casa Del Mar. It's the Casa
Del Mar
Club on the beach at Pico and Oceanfront.
Wow. So that's the one that we could see in that corner.
Yes.
See, I didn't pay anyone. I was setting it up. See how I did that teacher move right there. Right? And so you start to those of you who haven't seen these, you start to think about, okay, so why is there this fence there, right? And there's some key words in that description that comes from the collection that tells us they're in the segregated part of the beach. And they are there, we don't know on a weekend or on a date, but we know that it's before they're about to get married. So obviously,
they just gotten married.
Oh, we've got to correct that one. All right.
Yeah.
There.
Thank you, Daddy.
It's a lot of information to remember. I've been looking at this much longer than you all.
Thank you. So we thought that these two pictures can very much be understood in a way, right, in terms of what we see as this postcard, what we start to see in terms of the reality for Black Angelenos at this time coming to Los Angeles, and where they're coming to and what they're experiencing. And if we think about a juxtaposition of a segregated beach, being a newlywed couple, not being allowed to enjoy, right, and to move freely, and having to be at the inkwell. And then we think about this juxtaposition of that with, can you go on to the next slide, Daniel? This is what Du Bois writes about in The Crisis about California, right? He talks about the charm and the mystery of California, about how California's history is very much tied to African Americans, because California is one of those states that chooses to come into the Union as a free state right before the Civil War, right? And then he talks about right, that life in California for African Americans, for the Black Angelinos, is this wonderful life. He writes, these colored people are pushing and energetic. They are without doubt the most beautifully housed group of colored people in the United States. They are full of push and energy and are used to working together, right? So there's this ideal vision, right, of California that Du Bois is helping to, Du Bois is sending out there, right, to people to come to California, juxtaposed with this picture of segregation. And oftentimes we've been talking about this mythology around California and life in California, and that things were way better and there wasn't any racism, there wasn't any, segregation. If you just came to California, you had made it. And that wasn't only the dream for the Black community, it was the dream for immigrants of Mexican descent, immigrants from Asia, immigrants from all over the world, right? And so we want to start looking at this history in ways that invites us to look at some of that truth that we haven't heard before and seen before, but also to look at this with another lens of resiliency and joy, and also to look towards the future and what this history that we're going to learn about today offers us in terms of dreaming about that future. So without much ado.
Yeah, so it's my my honor to introduce our guest historian today. Professor Allison Rose Jefferson is a third-generation Californian. Presently, her research and professional interests revolve around the intersection of historical memory, American history, and the history of the African-American experience in Southern California during the 20th century, Great Migration and Jim Crow era. She's also interested in heritage conservation, spatial justice, and cultural tourism. Her work she's interested when her work intersects with the experiences of people of African descent in other global settings, along with other work activities utilizing her knowledge and skills expertise. Professor Allison Rose Jefferson has written a book, Living the California Dream, African-American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow. Oh, it's not showing up here, but there it is. It's a great book. And this was published in 2020 by the University of Nebraska Press. The study examines how African-Americans pioneered leisure in Americans' frontier of leisure through their attempts to create communities and business projects in conjunction with the growing African-American population of Southern California during the nation's Jim Crow era. The places that Professor Jefferson examines illustrate a range of recreation and relaxation, production purposes, and societal encounters at the beach and in locations. I also wanted to mention that Professor Allison Rose Jefferson is currently working with the Getty Museum and is doing some additional research on similar projects and similar stories. And I'll let her talk more about that. And she is going to talk about her research, her scholarship that was published in Living the California Dream. And today's talk is called Recentering the African-American Experience in Santa Monica and California History. So let's go ahead and give a round of applause for Professor Allison Rose Jefferson.
Thank you all so much for inviting me to come today to share in this experience of learning more about what California had to offer at an early part in the 20th century. And I'm so excited that UCLA Center X and our teachers, two of which are with us today, who participated in developing these lesson plans, Christina and Shamora. And then also we had two other teachers involved with us. But I'm really just happy that we were able to come together to create the lesson plans that you're going to learn more about out of this research from the book and this research for the Belmar History Plus Art Project. So I, as an African-American woman historian and heritage conservation consultant, have a practice that is intentional in my social justice actions that I participate in to expand knowledge for the construction of a more inclusive public culture, historical memory, and national identity, encompassing the diverse experiences of the American people, and to help dismantle institutional racism. This work has most recently manifested itself in a book and at intangible and tangible heritage sites. So sites where there's social history and sites where this social history took place, and there might be a building there at these sites. And these are various kinds of projects that I'm going to highlight a little bit today. So I have used history in broad educational programs, inclusive of the commemoration and conservation of places that are living links with past, present, and future generations. These places are the physical and spiritual reminders of significant times, people, and places in American history and culture. The projects I'm going to talk about today, Santa Monica's Belmar History plus Art, and a bit about my and a bit about some of the other projects to recognize history in Santa Monica, as well as a little bit about my new research that I'm doing on the Black Venice Enclave in Los Angeles's coastal zone, just south of Santa Monica. These are an outgrowth of my continuing work to develop opportunities to make the historical African-American California experience more visible through different methods for people's enjoyment as they gain knowledge and inspiration that can empower them now and in the future. So the Belmar History Plus Art project originated at a March 2019 California Coastal Commission meeting in Los Angeles, where I was invited to make a presentation on the historical African-American beach experience in Southern California. These are some of the themes that underpin the project, and I think you guys have this sheet in your notes. I gave it to you guys as a slide, so I think you guys have this. These are some things to think about as you are looking at the presentation today, and also in terms of the two pictures that you looked at the beginning of the presentation. These themes also relate to that, to those photographs. So at the meeting, in addition to making my presentation about the African-American beach experience in Southern California, I seized the opportunity to advocate that Santa Monica officials be required to develop an educational and interpretive program to teach the public about the erased history of the pioneering African-American visitors, residents, and business people who contributed to making Santa Monica a vibrant and unique place from the 1900s to the 1960s in beach neighborhoods south of the 10 freeway around what is the Civic Center campus today as a construction permit condition for what is now the historic Belmar Park at 4th and Pico. These are some other themes that underpin the whole, all the projects I'm going to talk about as well. So the commissioners saw my proposal as an action to set in motion their new wider environmental justice policy strategies as an implementation of their authority to help ensure equitable coastal access for marginalized communities. Santa Monica officials found funding to develop this new initiative that became attached to the park's construction and invited me to work on its development as the project historian. From fall 2019 to winter 2021, I and other contributors, some of who are on this call today, produced this multifaceted project, the first applied history with art project undertaken by the city of Santa Monica. My recent book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era, examines the local stories, as you heard a little bit about, of African Americans who fought for equal access to California's recreational offerings at specific inland resorts and beach areas as they contributed to the broader freedom rights struggle during the nation's Jim Crow era. They made history in what has been called the frontier of leisure in their attempts to create communities and business projects in conjunction with their growing population in Southern California. In Los Angeles, leisure was not an optional add-on to civil rights, but an essential component of liberty. The Santa Monica Bay city's stories I unearthed in the book and the context essay, Reconstruction and Reclamation, the Erased African American Experience in Santa Monica's History, that I developed, underpin the work I and others used to produce the Belmar History and Art Project. Joining the essay, other programming includes a permanent outdoor exhibition of interpretive history panels that I produced the content for, and a large sculpture created by artist April Banks. And then Daniel Diaz of UCLA's History and Geography program, the Teacher Enrichment Program, and I, with master teachers, master public grade school teachers, two of who are with us today, Samora Gooden and Christina Paul, and then also Adrienne, and if I said her name wrong, I'm sorry, Kayati and Sarah Rodriguez. And they helped, we all together developed K through 12 lesson plans, which you're going to hear more about today, that meet the California State History, Social Science, and Ethnic Studies framework and curriculum guidelines. And I have to say that us developing these lesson plans are one of, I think, the crowning achievements of this project. These lessons are now available for review and for you all to use with digital primary source resources on the UCLA History Geography website and other places eventually. Other programming for this project included artworks produced by high school students inspired by the project's historical narratives. African Americans began, so this is, I'm a little slow on my slides, but anyway, this is kind of an overview of the project and kind of just a recapping of the things I mentioned. And now we'll go to the next slide. Okay, African Americans began moving in large numbers to the Los Angeles environs, including to Santa Monica and Venice, in the decades surrounding the turn of the 20th century, joining a multi-ethnic community of many national and global backgrounds. The majority of new Black migrants relocated from American southern states. Their stories are the public and private memories of African Americans of all socioeconomic classes. The new Negro who migrated to U.S. Northern, Midwestern, and far Western parts in the post-World War I decades to escape the worst of Jim Crow era racist, anti-Black restrictions and racial injustice. These migrants were more self-confident and sometimes militant in demanding their rights as citizens and as consumers. Similar to other groups who moved to the state, African Americans also embraced the booster-promoted California dream of a leisure lifestyle as a permanent way of life in picturesque outdoor settings, a mild climate, and new life opportunities, even while discrimination and lax enforcement of California's civil rights laws established as early as 1893 many times prevented them from using various public and private facilities and buying land in many areas for decades into the 20th century. Despite racial discrimination challenges, African Americans actively participated in California's development through the early 20th century Great Migration. They bought homes and other property, raised families, launched businesses, created social and faith institutions, and nurtured a rich cultural milieu that included the emergence of West Coast jazz and R&B music. The stories of these unrecognized voices, economic development initiatives and civil rights struggle, along with the places they inhabited, add new information and understanding about how African Americans sought to seize their California and American dreams to appropriate and shape the offerings of their new environment in the far West. The city of Santa Monica has the oldest African American settlement, has one of the oldest African American settlements of any Pacific Rim city in the region. First taking up residency with the founding of the city in the 1880s, some early Black settlers began establishing homes and businesses in the South Santa Monica beach neighborhoods around the 1900s. Until the 1960s, they lived in residential residential clusters radiating out around Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church at 4th and Bay Streets in Ocean Park. Other African American neighborhoods in the South Beach District were around the Belmar Place area, where the Civic Auditorium, new historic Belmar Park, and the Los Angeles County Courthouse are today, north of Pico Boulevard, south of the old City Hall, and also the other neighborhood was on streets north of Santa Monica High School, east of 4th Street. A short way south was a Venice Enclave, which began forming around 1910, which was considered part of this early African American community. Until the World War II years and following decades, most of these African American pioneers worked in domestic and service employment, while a few were small business entrepreneurs. All had faith in the promise of upward mobility. Education for their children was important. They were people who saved their money and bought homes and sometimes other real estate as soon as they could. They were strivers, joiners, and civil rights leaders of the era, not unlike those African Americans who moved to other parts of the West during the early decades of the 20th century. Like their counterparts all over the United States, African Americans lived, worked, and found joy in what the area had to offer, even as they tirelessly challenged oppression and discrimination in Santa Monica, in the Santa Monica Bay cities, to dismantle racial barriers when California civil rights laws were not enforced. Many of these African American pioneers attended Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, which opened in its own building in 1909 and was Santa Monica's first African American spiritual and institutional structure. It was also the denomination's first church west of Texas. The 11 stained glass windows of the church commemorate pioneering African-American families in the city who were members. In 2005, based on my research and leadership efforts, Phillips Chapel was designated as a City of Santa Monica local landmark for its sociocultural significance, not for the aesthetics of the building. The first minister of Phillips Chapel was the Reverend James A. Stout, born in Austin, Texas, and he eventually became a presiding elder of the region and was involved with founding several Christian Methodist Episcopal churches on the Pacific Rim. Accompanying him to his new ministerial post and life in Santa Monica were his wife, Mary McReynolds Stout, his baby daughter at that point in time, Bernice, and his mother-in-law, Ari McReynolds. The Stouts, along with other extended family members, made Santa Monica their permanent home. Christine Lawson, one of the Stouts' granddaughters, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren continue to make Santa Monica their home in the Ocean Park neighborhood. Christine's father, Hilliard Lawson, worked for a time as a U.S. Postal Service mail carrier, a caterer, and in buying and selling and developing real estate. He was civically active and became the second African-American to serve on the Santa Monica City Council from 1973 to 1975. When you're in the area and you have time, go into the Santa Monica City Hall, and you can see Hilliard Lawson's photograph on the old City Hall lobby wall. Like Christine Lawson, Patsy Jameson Cobb was born in Santa Monica, although in later decades. Patsy attended Phillips Chapel when she was a little girl and into her teens with her extended family. And her great aunt Odessa and great uncle Troy Billingsley, they moved to Santa Monica from Texas in the early 1940s, and they're memorialized in the church's beautiful stained glass windows. Patsy's mother and father, Pearlie and Leroy Jameson, along with other family members, followed the Billingsleys in the 1940s for new employment opportunities at Douglas Aircraft, which was in Santa Monica, and the shipyards down in San Pedro. And all of this new employment arose due to World War II. Pearlie Jameson relayed to me in an interview, it was exciting for her to move to Los Angeles, the Los Angeles area in 1944 to begin her new life for herself and the children she would raise in Santa Monica. The Billingsleys, the Jamesons, and their relatives lived for a few years on Pico near 3rd Street and on Belmar Place, a street that ran north and south between Pico and Civic Center Drive, parallel to what parallel to where the Civic Auditorium is today. Before moving, and they lived in these places before they moved on to other sections of Santa Monica and beyond. In the years surrounding Phillips Chapel, beginning, which the church began, as I said, at 4th and Bay Street in 1908, 1909, the Ocean area down the hill around Pico, south a few blocks to Bicknell, emerged as a gathering place where African Americans from all over the Los Angeles County area and beyond came to enjoy the beach's pleasures with less concern about racially motivated harassment and intimidation than at other beaches. While the boundaries shifted through time, it was a popular destination for African Americans during the Jim Crow era. So I want to call attention to these photographs. So the photograph that's on the left, this photograph was made closer to Pico around 1915. The photograph in the middle, which you saw earlier in our talk today, was also taken around Pico. And this photograph was taken in front of the fence that Casa Del Mar used to demarcate its beach area in front of the club where African Americans weren't welcome. So on the side where Verna and Arthur are, this is like Pico, okay? This is where African Americans hung out before the beach club was built. And they like this sign here to mark the spot of their enjoyment at the beach. So that's why they took a picture in front of it. This other picture on the far right is a picture that is south of the Casa Del Mar Hotel, which you can see in the background. And this is the area that became more known as the beach area that African Americans would hang out at. And that is between, after the beach clubs came in, and that is between Bay Street and Bicknell at the oceanfront. So one of the earliest service businesses, one of the earliest beach service businesses was the pioneering Black-owned La Bonita, which opened around 1914 on Belmar Place and was initially owned and operated by Francis and Moses Warner, and their daughter also was part of this management staff, Helen Warner. With a streetcar stop nearby, La Bonita was conveniently located to provide African Americans and other marginalized people with a place to change into their bathing suits, rent a guest room for overnight and extended stays, or have some refreshments. Through a succession of owners and different business configurations, La Bonita lasted until the 1950s Civic Center redevelopment and expansion raised the enterprise. Joseph Allen Reese and his wife Mildred, in the early years of their marriage, stayed for a few years in the early 1920s at La Bonita. Most likely, it was while they constructed their Venice home at 600 South San Juan Avenue, where they would live the rest of their lives. Joseph became became a Venice District U.S. Postal Service mail carrier, the first African-American mail carrier in Venice. He also was a real estate broker and active with various Black and white civic organizations, including the Postal Workers Union and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. For several years, Joseph won praise for his reporting and opinion pieces in the California Eagle, an African-American newspaper based in Los Angeles that covered news in the region. Later in his life, he became treasurer of Broadway Federal Savings and Loan Association, founded in 1946 by several industrious and civic-minded Black Angelenos. Joseph and Mildred and other Reese and Tabor family members and some friends moved from Louisiana to Los Angeles and Venice, California, by the Venice District of Los Angeles by the 1920s. Joseph credits his brother, Arthur L. Lewis, with the idea and inspiration to move to California. older brother Arthur migrated to the state around 1905 and is remembered in popular memory as a businessman and for his decoration work at the Kinney amusement facilities. The Venice district streets where the Reeses and other Black people settled before 1940 set the general contours of where most African Americans would eventually live as their population grew in the later 20th century. And just a sidebar, because we're not really talking about the other chapters of my book, but Arthur Reese was involved in developing a resort at Lake Elsinore, which I talk about in my book, the Lakeshore Beach Club. And we just found drawings of the Lakeshore Beach Club, which never got fully built out, that Paul R. Williams, the historic Black architect that some of you may be familiar with, his papers are now at the Getty. And I had been asking his granddaughter, Karen Hudson, since 2005, when I started this research, do you have any drawings of this resort that Paul Williams was working on? And she never found any, but when I was there, I just finished up my fellowship there, but as part of my fellowship, I asked, as they were looking through the collection, developing the finding aid, the indexing, if they found anything on this resort or anything else that, you know, was mentioned in my book, let me know. Well, lo and behold, they found the drawings of the resort, and I'm doing an exhibit around the content of the book at the California African American Museum, which will open next year, February 2023. And so we are going to show some of the drawings at the exhibition. So I'm sharing this also to you to say that just because we don't have materials right now about certain things in terms of our interests in communities of color, in terms of resources, that doesn't mean we won't find them later. So I just wanted to say that. So in addition to partaking of La Bonita's guest rooms and refreshment offerings, African-American visitors at one time could also stop to pick up meals to eat on the beach from the Arkansas Traveler Inn, run by the Dumases and Griswold, the Dumas and Griswold families on Belmar Place in Maine. The Black-owned eatery's 1930s advertisement stated it specialized in Southern-style barbecue with genuine barbecue sauce and fried chicken. Knowles and Foster owned Everyday Cafe, located at 4th and Pico Boulevard. Their establishment's 1940 ad in the short-lived Santa Monica African-American-owned Bay City's Informer newspaper showcased their offerings of quick service barbecue and special chicken dinners on Sundays and Thursdays. These Santa Monica Black enterprises were among a few important attempts at beach area business development that would be sabotaged by white supremacist actions from the 1920s even into the 1950s, overlapping the rise of Black beach culture and residency to support a deeper community life and African-American made place in the Santa Monica, Venice Bay area. As La Bonita's business was becoming established, also forming in the area was the small African-American resort community that became known as Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach, which I'm sure some of you have been seeing news reports about. It has, I discussed this, this particular site also in my book. So Black entrepreneurs and visitors were also attempting, in addition to Santa Monica and Manhattan Beach, to establish service businesses at other Southern California coastal cities. although in Los Angeles County and in Orange County, although the Bruce's Beach Enclave and other ventures in El Segundo and Huntington Beach were thawed or destroyed due to anti-Black racism and white supremacist actions of social economic sabotage and abuse of local government power, it is noteworthy that the small Santa Monica and Venice African American residential enclaves were able to develop and persist through the waves of discrimination and gentrification into the 21st century. While racial discrimination, and in particular racist restrictive covenants and other discriminatory actions, prevented African Americans from buying property throughout the urban region, their beach service businesses were sabotaged by white supremacist action a few times in the 20th century. Their community's presence and agency sustained their public space usage at the oceanfront near Santa Monica's Crescent Bay Park around Bay Street. This important gathering place was honored with a Santa Monica local landmark, was honored as a Santa Monica local landmark in 2008 based on its social significance as a place, even though there's not any buildings there to that had actions going on in them. Also recognized was Nick Gabaldon, the first documented surfer of African American and Mexican American descent in the Santa Monica Bay. The Bay Street oceanfront site recognizes African Americans' action to use this and other beaches, which embody the local stories that contribute to the national narrative of mass movement to open leisure spaces to all, demonstrating how the struggle for leisure and public space, along with political and economic issues, reshaped the long freedom rights struggle. In June 2019, this same beach area was honored with a listing on the National Register of Historic Places as the Bay Street Beach Historic District for its significance as a place of African American experience in U.S. history. It is Santa Monica's first historic district to receive this national honor and one of the few in California associated with any community of color. The Santa Monica Conservancy honored Michael Blum of the Sea of Clouds organization and myself with the 2020 Cultural Landscape Award for our work of accomplishing this National Register listing. Several of Santa Monica's pioneering African-American families, such as the Brunsons, the Carters, the Maxwells, the Dumases, and others lived on the streets north of Santa Monica High School before the expansion of the campus buildings and Interstate 10 freeway construction raised the neighborhood from the 1930s to the 1960s. When he was a toddler, surfing pioneer of color, Nick Gabaldon and his family also resided in this neighborhood. In re-examination of research for the Belmar History plus Art project, two sites with significance to the historical Black California experience in Santa Monica's early 20th century development came to light, which can potentially be designated as local landmarks. On the southeast corner of Pico and 4th Street, across from Santa Monica High School and diagonal to the historic Belmar Park, stands a building constructed by Manuel and Julia Morell in 1925. Originally from Kentucky, Manuel was Santa Monica's first Black mail carrier, and he and his wife, Julia, who was from Alabama, were also entrepreneurs. They lived in one part of the mixed-use building. The mixed-use building that they constructed, and they rented out the rest. The Morell building was the first office space for Santa Monica's first African-American medical professionals, Doctors Marcus O. Tucker and George E. Hurd. In the 1930s, Dr. Tucker, who hailed from Missouri, moved into the Morell building to operate his medical practice because he was not welcome elsewhere. Native Californian, Dr. Hurd, also located his dental office in the building at the time. Tucker would go on to build his own medical office building in 1940, just up the street at 424 Pico Boulevard, where Dr. Hurd would also move his dental practice for several years. Hurd later constructed his own dental office building in 1945, further inland at 1871 9th Street, just north of Pico and east of Lincoln. Hurd's building would also, which also still stands today, was designed by the African-American architect James H. Garrett, who was a contemporary of Paul Williams. And his work is getting lots of recognition in contemporary times. There's a new house tour that was just put together by the online portal Fort LA, which does things about architecture and design. Architectural aficionados appreciatively recognize Garrett's mid-century modern designed buildings. He also worked with Gregory Ain, for those architectural aficionados that are on this call, and they will recognize that Gregory Ain built several houses in Mar Vista that are considered modern masterpieces. So entrepreneur, and some of these people that I've mentioned to you all today are in the lesson plans that your teacher colleagues designed. They are part of the lesson plans. So entrepreneur and civic activist Lloyd C. Allen, who was the first African-American member of Santa Monica's Recreation and Parks Commission during the 1960s and early 1970s, ran his maintenance and janitorial supply business as a renter from this building at 4th and Pico for 25 years until he purchased it from the Morells. From 1925 to 2005, 80 years, the Morell building was significant as an African-American owned site of contestation, economic development, and community building. Originally from Louisiana, Allen has fond memories of his early years in California in the 1940s, when he sometimes walked 2 miles from his brother's apartment near Phillips Chapel CME Church to his sister's home in the heart of the Black Venice Enclave, where he lived for a time and developed a few lifelong friends. By the mid-1950s, the Morells were also collecting rent for their property on 4th Street, north of Pico, in the Belmar area, on parcels they leased to the city of Santa Monica for a police department garage and other municipal facilities. All of these stories that I've talked about today as it relates to the African-American experience and more are featured in the lesson plans, featured in the essay that I wrote that supports this project, and also featured in the historic Belmar Parks exhibition, the historic Belmar Park's installation of history panels. So these things also emanate from the research that I did for the book, and they are inspirational of the other components, the community engagement components of the Belmar project, and some of this research fed into the development of the two African American sites national and local landmark designation documents as well. In the future, I hope we are going to be able to present the rich history of the Black Venice experience in a comparable, engaging, and inspiring manner as we've done with Santa Monica. So with my work in general, I join with others who labor to convey individual narratives and national values in shaping the histories of who we are as Americans and influencing the ongoing discussion and learning about people and places that are considered worth celebrating and remembering in the public square. We need to increase equitable access to deep knowledge from places that create and preserve our cultural record, and from scholarly texts to community collections in the archives, libraries, and other repositories, and for culturally significant community sites. The stories and materials of historically underrepresented groups must be included, must include the narratives and cultural records to ensure that more authentic, reflective, complex, and nuanced stories are revealed, preserved, and told, as this helps build a more informed, culturally diverse, and civically engaged society. So since 2020, the nation and the world have grappled simultaneously with a pandemic, bizarre dystopian United States presidential election drama, the reinvigoration of the demand for racial equality and Black dignity and citizenship that were forced prominently onto the national and global agenda, and the efforts to strengthen our democratic norms and values after the domestic terrorism at our nation's capital in January 2021. Celebration and symbolism of the changes and solidarity with the global racial reckoning were articulated in the dismantling, defacing, and removal scheduling of monuments that symbolize iconography of a racist past, and that are a reminder of how systems have failed us. A wide range of structures are described as monuments or commemorative and storytelling spaces, including historical markers, statuary, earthworks, parks, memorials, museums, and art installations. They exist at the intersection of public space and political power, public memory, and the enthusiasm of groups which install them. Removal of public space symbols to a racist past are a significant step towards intentionally creating a more just future and important overdue structural reform. Symbolism matters. The debate surrounding removal of this racist iconography has been going on for decades. The Southern Poverty Law Center argues that current efforts intensified as a consequence of the national reflection that began in Charleston, South Carolina, after a white supremacist massacred 9 Black worshipers attending Bible study at the historic Emmanuel African American Methodist Episcopal Church in 2015. Others attribute the more recent removal wave to built up grief over social injustice and anti-Black racism, joining the energy of young people who are not willing to put up with continuing to walk each day by what Equal Justice Initiative founder and executive director Brian Stevenson calls the nation's landscape of misguided totems of hate, intolerance, and bigotry. The National Park Service guides the public policy of the U.S. Historic Preservation Program to engage Americans with places and stories which make up the national identity. But with less than 8% of the National Register sites and 3% of the National Historic Landmarks representing people of color, women, or members of marginalized groups, a systemized reevaluation must occur for reform of preservation policy and governance structures which privilege architectural value and material integrity over social value. Recognition of more diverse sites and creation of new public displays that recognize the underrepresented and challenge hegemonic and white supremacist narratives will help connect to a more representative history and identity. These new initiatives can be a vehicle for healing and education, as well as cultural tourism in communities. These highlighted old, new, and needed future public actions at commemorative spaces are also reminders there are still changes that must occur to dismantle white supremacy, police brutality, and anti-Black racism for a better society. Simultaneously to the needed national heritage conservation policy reform, new forms of monuments and spaces rooted in the ideas of commemorative justice should be asked for by those today demanding more inclusive narratives in public displays. These broader and innovative ways of sharing untold stories and places of Black life alongside designating landmarks, erecting traditional monuments, and other remembrance spaces will have a more lasting societal structural effect. Much more support for creation and preservation of African American cultural records that can provide accessibility to deep knowledge production must be part of this structural effect of broadening the American narrative of who belongs. African Americans have played a pivotal role in the nation's advancement. These contributions have been ignored, with the erasure being almost total. Black people's contributions have been ignored and not taught in history or other school classes or recognized in various levels of cultural site landmark programs. I joined scholars and others, like some of you here today, doing work that reimagines and reshapes the histories of who we are. In our work, we are providing enlightenment and inspire change as appropriate to our to how we can articulate these values in our respective practices. Our work tells engaging and provocative stories that challenge the viewer and the learner to see the world from different perspectives and presents transformative narratives that address issues of marginalization and challenges to oppression and bigotry and racism. As a historian and heritage conservation consultant on Belmar history and art, commemorative justice ideals were foundational to telling this more complex American story that we hope will enliven the past in emotionally resonating ways for more diverse constituents now and in the future. In broader and innovative ways, Belmar history and art's multifaceted educational, inspirational, and remembrance programming reconstructs, reclaims, and reinserts a more complex American story about the erased African-American, the erased historical Black life in the South Santa Monica Beach neighborhoods, which contributed to making the Bay City's lively cultural life. This reconstruction and reinsertion of public meaning of Santa Monica, public meaning of Santa Monica's urban landscape and heritage conservation amplifies a broader societal understanding of Black life as part of our shared, collective, and diverse California cultural heritage to provide broader coastal zone and other accessibility for present and future generations. The project is a timely contribution to the dialogue of the reinvigorated freedom rights struggle as it helps open and inform contemporary life for understanding of those who came before us in Santa Monica's historical African-American community life. It helps build a broader and richer and more accurate understanding of our shared history and identity in our global, national, regional, and local citizenship. At the same time, this project is a reminder of the loss of African-American social and economic space in the Santa Monica Bay coastal zone, and that there is still so much that is not understood about the history of the Santa Monica Bay cities, California, and the US. There continues to be history in places which need to be documented and made known to people. On this note, the Belmar History and Art initiative has inspired Santa Monica public officials to begin more efforts to address the legacy of racism and marginalization of people of color. Among them, Santa Monica officials announced the new Acknowledgement and Reframe initiative to focus on centering the voices and experiences of communities of color who have been historically excluded from discourse about representation in civic space and memory. In its announcement, Belmar History plus Art was identified as a demonstration project inspiring this new initiative. The city is now embarking on a public engagement process to reconsider the WPA, the Work Progress Administration era murals by Stanton McDonald Wright in the City Hall lobby, with the goal of commissioning new artworks that will convey more of the region's history and better express today's community values. And I hope that they'll think about doing some lesson plans also. So the Belmar History Plus Art project is showing its value on multiple fronts as a commemorative justice initiative that is an important symbolic action of equity and inclusion for social and environmental justice that recognizes African Americans and other marginalized communities have contributed to making the colorful history of Santa Monica. We have a right to historical and cultural sites and a place in the American identity, along with access to clean air, clean water, and enjoyment of all of America's natural and other resources. So I hope you will take time to learn more about these forgotten Black Western pioneers, their undertakings, and their California dreams showcased in the Santa Monica's Belmar History and Art Project components. In my book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era, in the lesson plans that you're going to learn a little bit about today. And I hope you'll ponder the implications of these stories for our lives and your work today. I challenge all here to use your voice and enthusiasm for informed professional and civic action that works to engage, educate, inspire, and empower you as individuals and society for equity, justice, and recognition of the underrepresented and disempowered in the redefining of a more inclusive American identity and sense of belonging by using, in this case, your classrooms and the Belmar History Plus Art lesson plans, and all the other resources that are available to you. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today, and I look forward to engaging with the rest of the program.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Allison Rose Jefferson. If you all want to unmute and clap, or just do that little clap emoji to show your appreciation. Thank you so much. And it's always great when we have historians who are also activists in their community, because there's just like a different layer of passion, and there's always like a really important call to action. And so that was greatly appreciated. We are going to explore the Belmar lessons in a few minutes coming up here, but before we transition to those lessons and a framework that Amparo and I are going to talk to you all about, we're wondering if anybody has any questions, maybe perhaps a couple of questions for Professor Jefferson here before we move forward. I know that was one. Sana, you were asking a question and I'm trying to scroll to find it. If you want to unmute and ask.
Yeah, Dr. Jefferson, you were referring to a Venice Enclave, and I was curious if you were referring to the neighborhood of Oakwood,
Yes,
or was that? I'm sorry?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I used to work near Oakwood, and I never knew about that history until I actually stopped working in that area. And so sometimes I see that history listed as Oakwood, and sometimes I see it listed as like West Los Angeles neighborhood or Venice neighborhood.
Well, it is the West Los Angeles neighborhood. It's Venice. It wasn't called Oakwood or Millwood or whatever. Not Oakwood is not Millwood, but those name designations came with various kinds of things that occurred over the last 40 years in terms of public policy initiatives and real estate stuff.
Got it. Okay, so it is the same area though.
Yes.
Got it. Okay, thanks for clarifying.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Sana. Any other questions for Professor Jefferson? Well, okay, that was a good teacher pause. We also have some of our teachers here who are familiar with the research and have read the book. So I sort of understand why we're not having more questions that we normally would. So that's great. And so what we want to do now is transition. We have about a half hour left for today's workshop. And for those of you who are with us from the beginning, you know that we framed Black LA through a, not to be redundant, but through a framework that was created by a history educator named LaGarrett King and a scholar. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. I'm going to just provide some quick context about Dr. LaGarrett King's Black Historical Consciousness framework. And then Amparo will pick it up from there, and we'll walk you through some activities to help you really think about application of the framework and then the Belmar lessons. Okay, so just bear with me as I pull up our slides here and share my screen. And I am, here we go. All right, so thumbs up. Do we see my screen? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Christina. All right. Whoops, I wasn't supposed to do that. All right. So Professor LaGarrett King created a framework for teachers to teach about what, not Black history, but Black history. So he's very clear about Black history sort of being kind of like a minimizing of like nuance and various experiences. When we talk about history in the singular for Black folks, it's sort of like avoids like the different experiences. And it also, I think he argues, lets history teachers off the hook, because then you can sort of default to the typical narratives. And I think one of the things that was so powerful about today's presentation is we found like the civil rights narrative in California was similar, but also very different and unique to Southern California. And especially, you know, I put in the chat the quote from Professor Allison Rose Jefferson about leisure as being not supplemental, but like part of liberty, right? It's a requirement. It's not something that just kind of is a perk of living in California. So LaGarrett King has this Black historical consciousness framework for teaching about Black histories. And he has some principles that he talks about. And I'm going to try to put in the chat the link to the article. Or Amparo, if you could do that as I'm talking.
Sure, and I will put in a link. I will let you know that this is an edited copy of that piece, so just be aware that you're not getting all of it because we know that it's quite long, its entirety. So
Yeah.
do that.
We edited, I think there's some highlights and stuff on the first page, but I think it has a very handy graphic organizer on the page. And that graphic organizer presents all of King's principles for teaching about Black histories through his Black historical consciousness framework. And some of the, I know that there's new ones. He introduced 2 new ones. And I think Amparo might have captured them here if I'm not mistaken. So you might see some.
So sorry. Yeah, social histories and Black futures are the 2 new ones that he shared with us during his presentation. So I made sure I captured them on here for you guys.
So these are his two of his new principles with the older principles. So go ahead and take a moment. You can read over the slide and just see, we pulled some quotes from each principle, and hopefully it gives you some context about how he's thinking about that particular principle. So maybe like a minute and a half just to kind of read through how he's defining these principles. And if you have any questions after that, you could ask in the chat or just unmute. Anybody have any clarifying questions about any of these principles? I know we didn't give you a whole lot of like context or time to read the article because we're like I said, we have a half hour left. But you do have the excerpted version that you can read on your own, and we encourage you to read it. And we're also encouraging, as part of this project, our teachers, our history teachers and participants who join these workshops to really rethink the way that we teach about Black histories to our students. And one of the powerful things here in this framework is that social histories piece. And notice how LaGarrett King is calling out like public historians, right? People who do research for their community, about their community, for the public consumption. And I think that captures Professor Jefferson's work perfectly, right? Introducing these different narratives that are community-based, help create a more nuanced, more clear vision of what the experiences of Black folks were. And in that, and then because of that, we get a better picture of what, history was like. So Amparo's I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Amparo, and she's going to talk to you a little bit more about this framework and about some of the things that we learned today about Santa Monica's Black community.
I also don't want to take, can we put it back, Daniel, real quick? So under Black historical contention, that's my language. Sorry, I've been playing with these ideas around Latino crit as well. And so we've been talking a lot about what are some of those internalized traumas that as a communities we've internalized and that we're passing on, and how do we get rid of some of these intergenerational traumas. And so I just put a couple of examples there for you that also apply to other communities, right? Just so you know that I don't want to say that this is, this was my interpretation of what Professor King was saying for Black historical contention. But it talks to some of those things that he really spoke about, like we can't sweep under the rug some of the things that we need to work on as different communities of color, right? And so that I really appreciate that that is part of that, those principles and that framework. So if you could turn to the next one, Daniel. And so what we'd like to invite you right now, I'm putting a link in. And Daniel, can you make that 50% so that people can see? Or 56? The link that you have in there, oops. Gotta get out of sharing mode. Sorry about that. The link that you have there right now is, has a couple of Post-its there. And what we're asking you is to think about, how do you connect what you heard today from Professor Jefferson, right? And how does what we heard today and the materials that we saw and the conversations that we've been having, how does that connect to this framework, right? So where might you put some of those in this framework? And you can just grab a bubble and then put it somewhere that you think it fits. So for me, the picture of the young women at the beach, right? Taking a picture, I call it, for me, it became the girlfriend's picture. To me, that's a symbol of joy. That's where I would put that bubble in. So we want to invite you to just take a couple of minutes to look for those bubbles, see where you see some connections. And take a bubble and put it where you believe. And you can move those bubbles around wherever you'd like to from what you heard today. I want to give us time to look at the lessons. So if you could take a moment to finish up your last thinking. One of our attempts with this was to bring us back to our first session and to think about how theory informs us as educators and how theory can also help us to develop content, as well as help us to develop our students' abilities to see themselves as agents, right? And members of the community that can push forward to helping to bring about change. And so how do theories and how do materials that we receive and that we collaborate with professors help us to make that bridge and that gap to that social action, and to also encouraging students to see themselves as part of this long trajectory for social justice. And so we thought that because we're educators, that these frameworks and these principles help us to make those connections. So I hope that that helps you. And I know some of you weren't with us to read the article, but I hope that you go back to the article to see more of those connections. And I apologize that we're kind of doing it really quick as well. So, Daniel.
Yes.
Take us home.
All right. Okay, so we have been kind of hinting at this, and we are now going to go ahead and turn our attention to these amazing lessons, this curriculum that that was designed in collaboration between Allison Rose Jefferson, who is sort of like our scholar in residence. It was an amazing opportunity to collaborate. Rarely do we work side by side with a historian the way we have with Allison Rose Jefferson. And then some really terrific teachers who are, you know, from and around the area. We have the lesson that was designed, and I'm going to put the link in the chat for you all as I talk. The lesson that was designed for elementary, for 3rd and 4th grade, was designed it was actually 2 lessons designed by Christina Paul, who's here with us. And her lesson includes a walk and talk or tea party activity that has almost all of the historical characters that Professor Allison Rose Jefferson introduced us to today are found there for students to learn and sort of like become those characters and exchange information about their life and their experiences with other students representing other characters from Belmar. The 8th grade middle school lesson was designed by Shamara Gooden, who's here with us as well. Shamara is an amazing teacher. She teaches in middle school in Linwood. Christina, by the way, works at the lab school over at UCLA. And then the high school lessons, 11th grade, that you'll see there if you scroll. And maybe I could click on it for you so you can see the screen. The 11th grade lesson here was designed by Adrienne Cariotti, who is a 11th grade US history teacher at Santa Monica High School. And then our ethnic studies lesson was designed by Sarah Rodriguez, who is a English, Chicano studies, ethnic studies teacher at Santa Monica High School as well. Each lesson is in face-to-face format, so like in person, and then also, because they were written during pandemic, in digital format, so you could add them to your Google Classroom. And we used Google Docs for those lessons. So all the lessons are there. What we're going to ask you to do is click and explore, right? You're going to want to explore the lesson that makes the most sense for your context, where you, the grade level that you teach should probably be the thing that you prioritize in making your choice. And then what we would like you to do is to think about some questions. These are some sort of guiding questions for you all to think about. So thinking about the lesson that you're looking at, and we always use this term at the History Project, is sort of like, we're not talking about replacing narratives with these sort of like local narratives. We're talking about layering in to make this more of a complicated, richer story for students, layering in some of these local stories, and maybe as substitutes for other histories that you would talk about that maybe aren't local, but maybe adding this to a unit, say on civil rights would be an example. And then the other couple of questions there are exploring your students and how you would introduce them to some of this history and kinds of conversations, and also thinking about how these lessons can help students think ahead. Right, that ethnic studies lesson does a really good job of that in particular. But how does these lessons help students think about the future, and what does it mean to be Black in LA, for Black folks in LA, and what can we collectively do to continue some of the good work that is being started in some of those communities like Manhattan Beach and hopefully Santa Monica, or in Santa Monica, and hopefully Venice.
You want to go to the one before and enlarge it so they can have the questions as they read, please? Sorry, I kept on messing up your slideshow presentation.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
All my little notes in there messed everything up. Thank you, Daniel. So we have about 16 minutes left. We'd love to give you about 10 minutes to peruse the lessons. Please also make sure you stretch, take care of yourself as well. as we have been on for over an hour and a half. And then we will call you back and we'll have some conversations and we'll do some debriefing. And we'll also invite you to some future workshops that we're working on. All right. Hope some of you can put in the chat maybe some answers to the questions that you see on your screen. How might these lessons open up an avenue for you to have some difficult conversations? What extensions might you add to the lessons? And then how might these lessons help your students think about the future and do some hoping and some healing? If you have a moment, please put that in the chat. We'd appreciate it as we're wrapping up. If you want to unmute and tell us, feel free to do that as well. Thank you, Daniel. Art as a means of healing and thinking. Anyone else? I know we're getting close to time. Daniel, if you could go to the next slide. I put a link in there. You have it in your slides for today, right? One of the things that we've been working a lot in before we were thinking about Professor King's principles, is this idea of how do we connect, and Shamara has been a part of that conversation, right? How do we connect past events and past stories to current events going on today and to those push for social justice and agency in students, right? So one of the links that I just put in the chat for you is an initiative in Santa Monica, right? Oh yeah, look at that. Thank you, Professor Jefferson. Thank you. That's wonderful. In La Veinte, oh my God, that's where near my godparents used to live. So how do we have these pieces in conversation with what is currently going on, right? And what examples do we have of people in different communities pushing for healing and pushing for ways of making restitution for past, grievances, but also bringing people back to the community. So Santa Monica has an initiative to offer the descendants of the Belmar community housing, right? That is at a market value or that they can apply for housing. I forgot the name of the initiative. Why am I blanking out right now? I was quoting the initiative. Oh, there are the shoes. I told you about the shoes. Those are the cool shoes.
The initiative, I mentioned
We
it.
saw.
I mentioned
And then
it.
also, Jaime shared with us that wonderful connection, and Professor Rose did too, Jefferson did too, with other communities there, right? And folks knowing one another and being in communion with one another as well. And those are important pieces. There you go. It's below market housing.
Okay, so that's what I was going to say. I did
Businesses
mention
and
that
people.
I did mention it in my slides. I just didn't talk about it, but that was inspired. The Belmar History Plus Art Project inspired the below market housing initiative, and they've said that in the press. And then also it was it has inspired the I just kind of talked about the new art program, but it also inspired them to do the Cesar Chavez and Juneteenth local holidays in Santa Monica as well.
Incredible. Okay,
We
I'm
are-
going.
Go ahead, Daniel.
No, I'm saying I'm going back to our slides because it is 6 o'clock, and I would love to sit and talk more about the impact that the project has had, but I do also we both want to be respectful of everybody's time. Amps, I'm not sure if you finished your thoughts though, so I'm sorry if I interrupted you.
No, I was going to say the same thing that you were. It's time to go. It's time to go. We'll stick around. Go ahead. Yes, there you go.
Yeah, it's time to go. And we're just going to let you know of one upcoming workshop featuring Kelly Lytle Hernandez, which is on April 19th. She's going to be talking about her new book, Bad Mexicans, which is the story of the Magon brothers who were here in the United States, but we're sort of directing the revolution from afar. It's a really amazing story. She's going to tell that story. And then we're going to have a follow-up session with one of our teacher leaders who will showcase some of the lessons that Dr. Hernandez is going to show on the 19th, and then include a strategy for teaching those to your students. In the summer, we have 2 workshops. Our first one is ready for you all to register if you're a 7th grade teacher. We have 3 sites of encounter, and we're really excited about this workshop and featuring for the first time a Central American site of encounter. We're really excited about that.
And a Northern Africa one. Woohoo!
That's right. Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much, everyone. A special shout out to all of our amazing teachers and Allison Rose Jefferson for the amazing work and the activism. It's greatly appreciated, and we're seeing the impact of it. So, and just thank you all for being here to learn and engage in community and sharing with one another. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.